Thank you very much to you, the organizers of Duty 22, and to Rajgiri College, to all the young people who've done so much hard work to put it together and to build this amazing conversation around inclusion, around the SDGs, and around social and economic growth. For me, that means education because that has been my field of work. So I also thank you for inviting me here to talk about the social inclusion, and I say social deliberately, but the equitable inclusion of women in education. Um, to be honest, I think you did say girls, and I will take this as an indicator of gender based conversations, not limiting them to the two genders. So, whenever I speak across genders, it means the entire spectrum. And it is about designing solutions for the entire spectrum. I am not going to bore you today with lots of facts and figures because all of you here are experts. Some of you are young experts, some of you are more senior experts, and you have seen both the data you have and the studies, and you have personal experience in the field. Again, thank you very much to the organizers for bringing all of you together, and those of you who are going to listen to this recording. Again, thank you very much because now we will talk about building forward. Now we will talk about what do we do with what we know. What we know already is quite scary. What we know already is also reason for optimism. For example, we know that in schools, in so many ways, we actually have almost, okay, just before the pandemic, but we had almost achieved gender parity for girls and boys going to school. We had almost had this amazing time when girls were doing better than boys in examinations. There are reasons for that, and we're going to discuss that. I think it's very important to probe why girls do better in examinations, but then not necessarily do so well in life. There's something happening over here that we should be talking about, and that is about the entire purpose of education and about equity and inclusion in the very purpose of education. This I think is possibly the most important thing for us to talk about today, really, on what happens with the education that we manage to get. Not just what education we get, but what happens with it. And then the hows and the whys of it. Like, what is happening over here? What is happening over here when we put in all our efforts, we do everything right, we set up the schools, we set up the sessions, we train our people, and yet we are still fighting for that equity. And we are told that it's going to take another 100 years for equity to happen in terms of pay parity, etc. I'm not quite that patient. And I think none of us should be that patient when it comes to gender equity. Uh, it is not time to uh, pick fights, but it is definitely time to fight. Which means a definite drive towards a more aggressive approach, a more assertive approach to bringing gender parity. And I think the first step to being strong and assertive is humility. I have seen, and this is where I share my personal opinion with you, I have seen that we tend to approach problems that we have seen, observed, understood, analyzed, studied in great detail with a little bit of entitlement, a little bit of super confidence that says, I know what your problem is, therefore I can solve it for you. And I'm not totally convinced that any outsider can solve a problem for a gender or a community or any other way of doing things. And I would like us to talk about this today. In a way, the pandemic came to us as a wake-up call because we knew all the problems that existed with gender related problems that related to education, but they were not thrown in our face the way they were during the 2 years of the pandemic. The pandemic is still not over. We are still in the middle of it. But boy, have we been forced to come face to face again and again with the gender divide. Because what happened in education as soon as the pandemic struck? Lockdown, schools shut down. Even now, when you talk to school principals, everybody talks about that March the 15th, that March the 17th. That date is etched in our minds because that came to us as a shock. Our schools had to shut down, and therefore we had to all shift to online overnight. And that's when we discovered, was it that time when we discovered that some of us had online facilities and others did not? Is that when we discovered that we were favoring some sets of students over other sets of students? Is that when we discovered that boys have better access to mobile phones and devices and the internet than girls do? Is that when we figured out what all the disparities that were going on in our society? No, absolutely not. But that's when we could not hide from it. And this is why I would like us to take a moment as specialists and reflect on what we forgot to push through or what we were unable to push through till the pandemic forced this reality in our faces in terms of the digital divide. And therefore, I will thank the digital world in a way. And I will use that as a tool and a technique today for us to be able to understand what we need to do going forward. I will use it as a wedge to our own understanding of what we are doing right and of what we can do going forward. Because come every disruption, every innovator will tell you that, every startup person will tell you that. Come every disruption comes an opportunity to do things differently. And when we do things, when we get this chance to do things differently, when people are shaken up in their old beliefs, that is where, what does Leonard Cohen say? That when there's a crack, that's where the light gets in. We have seen a crack. We have seen this digital divide. But I do not think that we have understood that digital divide as well as we could have. And this is why I want to take this opportunity for us to reflect. And this is why this is a very reflective conversation, not a strident keynote, a reflective conversation, because this is time for humility, this is time for learning. Two things I would like to note here. One, that when we talk about learning and education, we often talk about it from a policy perspective. And a policy perspective is absolutely essential if we want to create large-scale changes. You will not be able to create large-scale changes till you have a scheme in place that is rolled out in so many districts, that is then evaluated in so many districts where you have some that do it well, you take the learnings from them, etc. Scale implementation is totally dependent on policy imperatives, and therefore getting policy design is right. But policy design doesn't come from a vacuum. Policy design often comes from our work and our studies in the development space. So many of you here work in the social development space. Much of what you discuss comes from a development perspective. I would like to posit that the education perspective, which I am hoping to share right now, is slightly different from the development perspective. And yet, both education and development perspectives have to feed into policy for these changes to happen. So that's the one point that I would like us to remember. That whenever we are talking about the changes that we suggest to policy, please do not only look at the development perspective. Take another lens called the education perspective. And how does that work in practice? How will that work in our projects and the work that we do? When you look at the development perspective, what are you looking at? You're looking at the inputs that go into a certain area. Even if you're looking at education inputs, you're looking at inputs that go into a certain area. You're looking at outputs, you're looking at outcomes. You are asked to give impact ratings to yourself. In fact, you will have assessors coming in, both for the policies that have been implemented and rolled out in your areas, and for the projects that you run. Your theory of change is about creating these impact things. Education too is about impact. But education is not always about efficiency or a hard hammer stroke. Education is about a gentle, slow burn of learning through life. What we tend to do when we look at it from the policy perspective, and certainly from the development perspective, is we ask, what can we do? And therefore, what that translates into, How can we teach? How can we resource? How can we build infrastructure? That is a very top down approach. I would like to sort of literally say this, that is a top down approach. It is almost patronizing, partially even patriarchal in the way it operates, whether it is men or women. Even I, if I go in there as an outsider, will find myself adopting the patriarchal approach, saying, I am giving this to you, I am ennobling you, I am empowering you. Whereas education truly is about learning. It is about that seed that grows. So what you are enabling as an outsider is not the plant. You are enabling the soil around it. You're making sure that you have your water cycles right, etc. You are enabling the ecosystem around it. So I would really like to emphasize over here that what we are talking about today is about ecosystem enablement. And when it comes to gender, the difference between the ecosystem that is available to men and to women and to the other genders is stark. We have only just been able to enroll the third genders, the other transgenders, etc., in a university. Only just been able to do that. That is huge progress, that is reason for hope, but it is also something that should make us pause and think, we should have done this sooner. When we talk about women, let's talk about the learning of women. How do women learn? How much do we know about how women learn? Is there a difference? I mean, if you're talking about the Pythagoras theorem, is there a difference between the way boys will learn and girls will learn? Not in the classroom. If the girls are in the classroom, if the girls have the same supportive ecosystem for teachers, for maybe even tuitions, for going home and having the time to study, if they have that entire ecosystem built for them, then of course it is equitable. There is no difference in curriculum, there is no difference in assessment, there is no difference in the way the lesson is being taught, or pedagogies, that's what we call it. Does that make it equitable? Sure, it's equal. That is not necessarily equitable, because the enablement ecosystem for women, which is where we come in as social workers, which is where we come in as development and education professionals, has still not grown up enough. And this is why I want to hark back to what the digital divide showed us. The digital divide showed us that we do not have just one digital divide. We have, and this is something that I've been writing about and will continue to write about, we have 6 digital divides. There are 6 lanes in which we need to progress in order to fill this bridge, this divide that we have found between the digital haves and the digital have-nots. 3 of them are common across genders in different ways. In fact, it is a gradation, it is a spectrum. The first digital divide comes with basic electricity. You know all about that. I do not need to belabor the point. The second digital divide definitely comes with the information highway, whether you have internet or not in your area. The third digital divide comes from device access. There is definitely a gender bias when it comes to device access. And the ability to use the device, how much you can use the device. Are you allowed to use it on your own? Do you have it for a full hour of learning? Will women be able to do a whole afternoon of learning, or will they be able to do this learning in the morning? Will they have access to public devices such as the television screen or radio, or will they have access to private devices and private spaces such as the internet and smartphones? Or is it only going to be a non-smartphone, as we know from many of them, even if they have access? So which device do they have access to? Our solutions have to work across all 6 of these lanes. Now, these are the hard ones. And these are the ones where we expect a top-down solution, rightly so. Because you cannot expect a poor person in the village to be able to suddenly create an internet infrastructure. Even though they have. In Kutch, they have created their own local internet structures. There are wonderful local solutions also that inspire us. But that cannot be a responsibility. The responsibility has to be that, because education is a public good, the responsibility has to be public. There is no doubt about that. But the other 3 are much more local, and where we have a huge role to play. And the other 3 digital divides are that of safety. Safety is the first step to learning. You cannot have learning unless you have a safe learning environment. So if you have girls who are not able to safely access hubs or libraries where you have digital internet access, safely access schools, we know that many of them, when they walk to school, especially in some very very difficult areas, are not able to safely access schools. This has become more evident to us in the digital space. You see a girl with a mobile phone, okay, that's it. You're flirting with boys, you have pictures being shared across boys, you're communicating with people you do not want to. There's a ridiculous amount of nonsense out there. Many of you have seen it in real life. That safety of access to learning is critical. The second thing that is totally critical, especially across genders, is the space for learning. Do you have a quiet, calm space for learning? How many women do you know who actually are able to sit down and sit and actually look at their phones for an hour at a time just to be able to listen to a lesson and take notes without being called out to make a cup of tea or to wash the dishes or to put the clothes to dry or whatever else needs to be done around the house? Because they're seen as traditional roles, because they are seen as people on call all the time. There is always so much to do when it comes to digital spaces that need to be created, both for digital learning and for real learning, physical learning. But the most critical one is the last lane where we have this opportunity to progress learning dramatically. And that is simply again about humility that I referred to before. Look at the way women have been learning. WhatsApp groups have become popular, and WhatsApp is used by the British Council as part of their teacher practice. Look at the way that women actually access learning. The courses that women used to do even in generations before. Women access learning in two or three specific ways. Women access learning in communities. One of them learns stitching, 4 or 5 women will gather around and say, oh, let me learn how to do this neck pattern in a blouse for you, and let's do it together. Can you do a little bit and I will do a little more for you? That's how knitting happens. That's how you learn things socially. So you build communities of learning, you build emotional connect with your communities of learning, you learn socially. You learn because you are able to create a certain amount of visible good in your personal ecosystem. Very often these are not about grand ecosystem changes, but these are about personal ecosystem improvements. So it's not necessarily something that will create monetary value. Women do not need that incentive to learn. Also, women's learning has constantly been lifelong. And since we have already achieved that, we should be able to build on that. And that is the sixth lane of learning. So when we are designing learning for women, do not ask women to go to schools or colleges or boxes or buildings at a certain time. Your boxes there are too many ways of boxing in learning, and then asking people to pass through so many gates and barriers. You have to go at a certain time. Right, you have to go at a certain time when the cow needs milking. So are you going to go to the milk shed, or are you going to go to school at that time? There's a trade-off there. You have to go to school in a certain uniform. You have to go to school in a certain manner. You have to go to school with certain process. You have to go to school and sit in that box called a room or classroom. A very interesting piece of data that was released just yesterday, we haven't had time to analyze it yet, is that during the lockdown, UDICE has released enrollment data for schools. That when all of these rules of schoolbazi, and I will call it schoolbazi, the drama that we have around schooling, not necessarily education, around schooling, once this was cut down and you did not really have to go to school, school enrollments went up. Which meant that the commitment to continuity and learning is clearly there. We do not have the gender divide for that data yet. It will come out this week. So do look out for this data. But let us recognize that when it comes to equitable learning, our future is already here. And the future is hybrid. And we must design hybrid systems that are inclusive. Hybrid does not mean blended. It doesn't mean just a combination of online and classroom. It means you take the learning to where the student is. Just as we began to learn how to do this in the pandemic, figure out at what times of day women are able to study. Make sure that they have access to learning at that time. Figure out what is your uh, where women learn, how women learn. Therefore, make your learning tools social. Build an emotional connect and a support structure around learning for women. That is how you're going to make learning accessible, equally accessible for men and women. Because the way learning has currently been designed for certain linear structures has been designed by men for men. In order to make it equitable, we need design for women as well. And I would love for us to be able to continue to progress this conversation around designing hybrid learning, where learning comes to women in the way that works for women. And that is how we bring not just equality, but also equity in this conversation about education for across genders. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for joining in this conversation. And I thank you for the future of equitable education that you will build. Thank you.